And as a constituency MP, and you know this from experience you've had, Ian, but whether in Norfolk, whether in Cambridgeshire, many of my voters are not earning these sort of sums. So of course, consultants is a very specialist job. Of course, they should be well remunerated, but there is a career ladder. We've put in a 10.3% in terms of the entry level, average 8.8% for the junior doctors, and we have moved, as you say, on pension tax. And when you say you characterise that as Tory mates, well, they're striking against the Conservative government. They're actually protesting at the Tory conference, and the junior doctors' leaders said even if the same offer was made as in Scotland, they still wouldn't accept it because it is a politically inspired strike. So there's a number of factors there, but we have, as I say, accepted the PRB, accepted the pension changes, but we've got to bring inflation down.
Why don't you call their bluff? And I mean, I don't know what the financial implications of offering what the Scottish government has settled on, but I mean, surely that would expose them if they didn't accept that.
And why would that be fair to nurses, Ian?
I'm not saying it would be.
Well, that's the issue.
But, I mean, you can't allow this strike just to go on for year after year after year, because in the end, waiting lists will never come down if that's the case.
But look, to your challenge of is the government moving, it did move in accepting those things. But it also has to be fair to the rest of the workforce. It has to be fair to our armed forces, our teachers, our other public sector workers. And it also has to be fair to those in the private sector, and particularly be cited on inflation.
That's Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, speaking to me earlier this month at the Tory conference. And you can hear our full on-stage conversation by subscribing to the Iain Dale All Talk podcast on Global Play. I should say Policy Exchange hosted that event. Coming up in the next hour, it is Tuesday's edition of Cross Question. We have with us Joe Gideon, Conservative MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central, Simon Marks, LBC's US correspondent, Alan Smith, SNP MP for Stirling, who's the party's Europe and EU accession spokesperson in Westminster, and Mathew Hulbert, Liberal Democrat activist and political commentator. They're here to answer your calls. We actually almost have a full switchboard, but there are 2 spaces free if you get your fingers dialing right now. 0345 6060 973. And don't forget, you can watch us on Global Player.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has renewed calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The UK is believed to be in discussion with leaders in the region to try to free hostages taken by Hamas. It's been confirmed the cap on bankers' bonuses will be removed. The idea was initially announced by Kwasi Kwarteng last year during his time as Chancellor. The Financial Times Whitehall editor Lucy Fisher has told LBC the decision's being met with criticism.
When you look at the Bank of England Prudential Regulatory Authority, its chief executive has long said that they've not been a fan of this limit on banker bonuses. They think it's damaged the competitiveness of the City of London. It's had an impact on labour mobility. So in some sense, we've heard the music for a while that they would like to see this scrapped. And of course, today, the government has followed through.
Financial regulators say it's part of plans to make the UK more attractive, having left the European Union. The Immigration Minister has confirmed the government plans to end the use of hotels to house migrants. Robert Jenrick says ministers will start terminating a total of 50 contracts in the coming days. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 14 points at 73.89. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.14. LBC weather, heavy rain moving south with an overnight low of 3. Cooler and cloudy tomorrow with patchy rain for most, a high of 14. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello and welcome to Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. With me on the panel tonight, on my left, Joe Gideon, Conservative MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central. To her left, Alan Smith, SNP MP for Stirling. He's the party's Europe and EU accession spokesperson in Westminster. To my right, Simon Marks, LBC's US correspondent, making an all-too rare visit to our studios. And Mathew Hulbert is to his right, political commentator and Liberal Democrat activist. You can, of course, call 0345 6060 973 if you have a question for our panel. You can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And of course, do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Just to say that given the news at the moment, I think a lot of people think we're only taking questions on Israel and Gaza. Not the case. We will be taking other questions a little bit later in the hour. So if you have a question on any other issue, do feel free to ask it. But first, James is in Barnes. Hello, James.
Hi, good evening. Hi, I'd like to ask the panel, do they not think, or do you not think, that the time has come, and I'm a Jew, and I'm as abhorred and disgusted, and words fail me as to what happened on October the 7th. But I would use those same adjectives to describe what the Israeli government is doing now to the Palestinians. It makes me ashamed to be Jewish. And I think it's about time that the West, that the Americans, that the French and the British say to Netanyahu, enough is enough, because this is ethnic cleansing, quite frankly. They are moving, they've moved the Palestinians, they told them to go south. On Channel 4 News tonight, they're bombing. 90 people died, I think, today, bombed in the south. And to treat 2 million people when half of the
James, I need a
population
question.
is under 15. Anyway, so my question is, do they think now the time has come that the United Nations with the West says to Israel, enough is enough, you've got to have a ceasefire and allow proper humanitarian aid to come to the help of the Palestinians?
Simon Marks.
Well, I think that James raises a number of very interesting questions there. I mean, certainly over the last days since October the 7th, I mean, once again, the weakness of the United Nations as an institution has been on full display. And of course, the weakness of the United Nations as an institution relates to the architecture of the United Nations. The United States, Britain, France, 3 of the permanent 5 members can certainly go to the UN Security Council and say, let's take some action. But Russia and China have veto powers on that Security Council. There are all sorts of powerful nations that are not represented at the highest level of the Security Council, and it's far from evident that the United States, Britain and France could get much accomplished there. I mean, I do think that there's no question that the situation on the ground would be a lot worse had it not been for the efforts of President Joe Biden to kind of force Prime Minister Netanyahu to restrain himself. I mean, I think it's almost not going too far to say that at the moment Joe Biden is the de facto Prime Minister of Israel. I mean, he is talking to Netanyahu every single day. Today, the White House put out a readout of their latest call. It was much more detailed than readouts that we'd seen before. It was absolutely clear that once again Joe Biden had said to Netanyahu, don't even think about launching a ground offensive while there are all of these hostages' lives
Because that's
at
what
risk.
we all expected Israel to do,
and this
probably by October the 10th.
Absolutely.
And they still haven't.
And indeed, the defence minister of Israel, 72 hours ago, was telling troops, stand by, you'll be seeing Gaza from the inside momentarily. And it's absolutely clear that Biden particularly, also, Rishi Sunak when he was there, Macron as well, and others, are saying to Benjamin Netanyahu, we'll let you take some action, but you're not doing the full ground offensive. Now, James is obviously, with justification, concerned about the action that is already being taken and the civilian loss of life that has occurred. But the emphasis that Joe Biden is placing on the need to get humanitarian assistance into Gaza and the emphasis that he's placing on holding back from that ground offensive is not just lip service. I mean, it would be normal, I think, for people to think that an American president talking about humanitarian relief for Gaza would be lip service. This is more than that. This is Joe Biden saying, just hold on a minute. Let's not plunge the region into the kind of crisis that he absolutely doesn't want to have to navigate.
I think the Netanyahu of old would have basically
Yes.
stuck two fingers up at Joe Biden and said, I don't care what you say,
Yeah.
we're doing it. It's our decision. But Netanyahu's position has been completely weakened by what happened on the 7th of October.
Totally weakened by what occurred. Totally weakened, of course, by the months that have led up to it and his efforts to water down some of the checks and balances at the heart of Israeli democracy. And also just bear in mind that 72% of the components that make the interceptors of the Iron Dome system are manufactured in the United States. That puts Joe Biden alone in this conversation in a very powerful position.
Well, I've learned something tonight. I didn't know that. I'm sure our listeners have too. Alan Smith, as well as answering the question, today it seems as though the international community has started to splinter a little bit, while you've got the EU overtly calling for a ceasefire. The High Representative, I think he's called, Joseph Bonner. And Macron's been in Israel today as well. Britain says it's up to Israel to decide whether it has a ceasefire. America started the day agreeing with Britain, and now it seems to have shifted its position a bit. Now, how dangerous is that for the international community, or certainly the Western international community, to appear to split?
Well, this is the issue, and the international community has had decades of double standards when it comes to the Middle East peace process. There has been flagrant breaches of international law on all sides, and there's not just two sides. This is a complicated place. I grew up in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. I know the Middle East.
Did you?
I did. We spent much of the 80s there.
Well, I want to hear a lot more about that, but possibly not tonight.
Well, we certainly did. My entire family, we've got really happy memories of the Middle East. My folks, I've just retired back from Kuwait. We've got sand in our blood, and everything is connected to everything else, and history didn't start last week.
No.
And there's a lot of hurt on all sides here. And the SNP's perspective, and I think most of us, and frankly I'd say anybody sensible, the starting point has to be, well, international law. And international law must be respected. Innocence must be respected. Should there be a ceasefire? Well, of course there should, for goodness sake. What's to think about? There has to be a ceasefire. And this, as we've seen in some quarters, this hierarchy of victimhood, and our victims matter more than your victims matter, and selective, picking out the evidence of how beastly the other sides are. Well, yes, that's all valid, but what we do need to see is a more coherent approach from the international community. But the international community is split on this stuff, and I'd agree with the comments about President Biden being in a unique position, because there is a very strong relationship with the US, with the State of Israel, and they are in a position to be, if not an honest broker, at least exert influence. And we've not seen the international community ready for this or prepared for this, but equally, to what extent should the international community be able to intervene on a moment's notice in different countries? This is complicated stuff. We've seen that in Ukraine, it took a really concerted effort to get an international consensus together in defence of Ukraine's sovereignty. But it took about 8 years for that to come, because Crimea was annexed and much of eastern Ukraine was effectively annexed before that happened. So this is really sensitive and really tough. But I really want to get across to folks who might be listening from the Jewish and Muslim communities within Scotland, the UK, that you are precious parts of our community, and both Islam and Judaism are peaceful religions. And I appreciate and deeply, deeply empathise with the fact that a lot of people in these islands are feeling really hurt and in pain right now at what's going on within the Middle East, and a ceasefire surely has to be the first way to start to get to reconciliation.
Just a brief comment on the First Minister Hamza Yousaf. His parents-in-law are in Gaza at the moment, and he's made some quite moving comments about the situation that they find themselves in. How has that situation been received in Scotland?
There's a lot of love for Hamza and his wife Nadia as well, and we had our annual conference in Aberdeen just last week, where there was an emergency resolution tabled, which was led by them, and a lot of feeling that, well, this is a hellish situation for them personally, on top of a wider hellish situation, and Hamza really has proven himself to be a statesman, and I think the more people see of Hamza Yousaf, the more I think they'll see that sort of attitude where, in the face of deep, deep personal angst and upset, he's been able to maintain a really empathic and serious line. He went to the synagogue in Glasgow and has reached out to all the communities, and I think that's really important for all of us to be really careful about our language right now, not be partisan. And as I say, my starting point with all of this is international law and innocence need to be respected.
Joe Gideon.
Yes, I fully agree with what's been said. I think the role of diplomacy in this is crucial. I think that Hamas, ultimately wanted to destroy the process of the two-state solution and the negotiations that were ongoing in the Abraham Accords. And we have to not allow a terrorist organisation to destroy the possibility of future peace. But I think, the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have shown real leadership on the world stage on this. They've been speaking to a range of countries across the Middle East, and the international community is going to be the vital, I won't say solution, because I think it's, as Alan has said, this goes back decades and it is so complex. I mean, I was in Israel Easter, and I was in Lebanon last year, and there are really no straightforward solutions to this. But I do believe that Israel has a right and duty to defend itself, and I think that the starting point for any peaceful negotiations must be the release of the hostages.
Okay. Mathew Hulbert.
So, first things first, what Hamas did on October 7th was outrageous, and you can't undertake an action like that and not expect a retaliation. And Israel is a state and it has an absolute right to defend itself. But it should be within international humanitarian law.
And do you think its response has been within the law? Because they're saying that these are not punishment bombings. These are targeted precision bombings to try and root out the Hamas terrorists, and that is allowed under international law.
Well, what the Prime Minister seemed to suggest yesterday was that it was almost for Israel to determine what is within international humanitarian law, and I'm not sure that we can quite...
Well, every country does that, and then they're held accountable for it, aren't they?
Indeed, and I'm sure we'll see the outworkings of this once this current situation is over. I mean, Hamas should release all the hostages immediately, and they seem to be doing so in a piecemeal way to try and say, well, look, we're releasing hostages. You can't have this ground invasion if we're releasing hostages every few days or however long, every couple of weeks. But I think in the long term, there needs to be talks akin to what we've seen in Northern Ireland. And I know this is a different situation, but the fact is there you had a situation that no one thought would ever be resolved, totally polarised elements, what you could call the extremes in the DUP and Sinn Féin, although I'm sure they would say that they're not the extremes of Northern Irish politics. But in the end, talks were brokered, the sides came together, the arms were put down, and there was a peaceful resolution that has kind of held for many years.
But there's a crucial difference, I'm afraid, in that the IRA had come to a conclusion in the mid-1990s that they could not win militarily.
Yeah.
Hamas haven't got there.
No, and show no signs of getting there. And so I think Israel is absolutely right to defend itself. But for Israel's own, I mean, I'm reminded that, I went to uni and studied journalism, and one of the first things we were told was that the first casualty of war is truth. And I think we are seeing, especially on social media, the kind of, I hate to put it this way, but the kind of PR war between the two sides. And I think for Israel's well-meaning in terms of how people think about it, they need to be seen to be being as humanitarian as they can whilst defending themselves, and they also need to be allowing more aid in, because really 20 trucks is almost neither here nor there in terms of what's needed on the ground.
I think it's 34 now.
Okay.
But I mean, even that is a drop in the ocean, yeah. I suspect. Well, we've got another question coming on this, but we'll have to wait a couple of minutes. It's 17 minutes past 8.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
8:20. Let me remind you who's on our panel. Liberal Democrat activist and political commentator Mathew Hulbert, Alan Smith, SNP MP for Stirling, Simon Marks, LBC's US correspondent, and Joe Gideon, Conservative MP for Stoke-on-Trent Central. Let's go to Hassan in Kensington for another question. Hassan, hi.
Hi there. A tube driver got suspended because he led a chant for Free Palestine on the speaker system. Would this have happened to him if he was chanting Free Ukraine? And are Palestinian supporters facing a new McCarthyism?
Well, Hassan is right. A London Underground driver has been suspended for starting a call and response chant on Free Palestine on a Central Line train on Saturday. Meanwhile, a scientific journal based in California called eLife fired its Jewish editor-in-chief Michael Elson today for sharing a link to a piece by the satirical site The Onion about indifference towards Palestinian lives. Joe Gideon.
So I think we have to be very, very conscious of how fragile our tolerant society is. When you see anti-Semitism in the streets, you see Jewish schools feeling that they can't open because people are intimidated, and whether that tube driver intended to cause offence to Jews. I mean, clearly in the context of what has just happened in Israel and the terrorist attack which killed 1,400 people and 200 still held hostage, it cannot be seen to be harmless. I think that's the key.
If he had shouted out, and I'm sure Mathew would encourage this, vote Liberal Democrat, would that have been seen in a similar way, or is it because it was about Palestine?
Yeah, well, it's the context, and it's the particular. I think it's on every news coverage, and there are the most awful images of what's going on in Israel and in Gaza. That we're all seeing on a daily basis, and so I think within that context, it is particularly, should I say, insensitive, I suppose.
Mathew.
I mean, that tube driver clearly shouldn't have been saying that. Nothing to do with his role, nothing to do with his job. He's not there to give his personal opinions on the day's national or international news over the speaker.
It might make life much more interesting if tube drivers did this all the time.
I mean,
especially if they're urging you to vote Lib Dem. I mean, it could be great banter.
Sometimes they sing, and that's okay.
Vote Lib Dem, folks. But no, I mean, I think so.
By the way, you're suspended.
Thank you. So what's it cancelled? So would he? Should he have faced some kind of telling off of disciplinary? Yeah, I would expect that. Whether he quite should have lost his job,
well, he hasn't lost his
job.
He's been suspended.
Oh, he's been suspended. Yeah. So there'll be an investigation, and we'll see what happens. Well, I mean, I think I probably think that I hope that he doesn't lose his job, but I think he clearly needs to be told that, come on, you're there to do your job when you're in your working hours. And
okay, yeah. Alan,
I'd broadly agree with that. I think there's a time and a place for statements like that. I've been on trains where the drivers talked about the latest soccer result, and we've all cheered, and it was a great banter. But it wasn't about a situation where people are losing their lives right now. And it clearly wasn't part of his job. It wasn't part of his remit. And as I said earlier, I think all of us everywhere need to be really careful about what we say and how we say it. And the perception of partiality, and Scottish politics is great for this, importing other people's struggles and domesticating them and trying to make it somehow about our own domestic political issues, is really, really dangerous and actually really offensive in this situation where it's a minute-to-minute evolving situation where hundreds, millions of people are in grave fear for their lives. And I think there's a duty in all of us to just calm things down to the extent that we can.
Simon.
Well, I agree. I mean, that clearly this had nothing to do with the job that he was performing at the time. And so in sort of professional terms, it seems perfectly reasonable that he should have been suspended. I mean, I come from here, but I live in a country with a First Amendment that allows an enormous amount of freedom of speech, but also a country where cancel culture is now very, very strong, and had a New York subway driver done something very similar, I think he or she too would have been suspended. I mean, the point that I just want to make is that it's such a binary response to what has taken place in Israel and Gaza, and it's misleading. I was in Gaza in 2006 when Hamas won that election against Yasser Arafat's Fatah. And the first thing that Hamas did after that surprise election result took place was streams of supporters took to the streets, and they immediately attacked the government building and removed the Palestinian flag and instead put the Hamas green banner up to fly over the building. So this notion, I mean, we've seen protests in New York, actually, where people have spoken of Hamas as the resistance, and this was a great victory for the resistance. This is not a resistance movement. This is a movement that is directly contradicting the aims and the plans and the hopes that Yasser Arafat and the PLO and then Fatah had for the Palestinian Authority. So these kind of binary responses, equating Gaza in Hamas in some sense with Palestinians just are not helpful to the conversation.
Right, let's go to another question. Thanks, Hassan. Chris in Richmond, I'm going to give you each 1 minute for your answers on this one. Chris, what would you like to ask?
Evening, everyone. The government's decision to move asylum seekers out of 50 hotels, cynical politics or a pragmatic decision?
Now, the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, has announced plans to end the contracts with 50 of the 400 hotels being used to house asylum seekers by January, with more contracts ending in the following months. We don't know which hotels these are. Cynics might assume that they might be in Tory marginal constituencies, but obviously I'm not a cynic. I wouldn't possibly think that. Let's go to you, Matthew, on this one first.
Well, my first question is, where are they intending on these people now going? I mean, has Robert Jenrick suggested what is now going to happen to these individuals? They're saying that the number of people coming across in small boats has declined by a fifth, so they're now in a position to do this, despite the fact that the number of people being processed is 175,000, which is the highest ever. Right. So that doesn't seem to add up, does it? And I mean, I just wish that I appreciate that it's a problem and it's an issue and it's got to be dealt with. But as I think a former Prime Minister once said, it's an issue that's got to be dealt with, not exploited. And I do worry with this government that actually it's an issue that they think they can exploit for votes rather than deal with the human beings that just want a better life.
Now, we haven't got a Labour representative on the panel tonight, but they're basically saying that, this is only 12% of the hotels. They promised to do this much more quickly. But nobody else seems to have an idea of how to house asylum seekers. If you don't house them in hotels and you can put 500 on a barge, but where are the rest going to go? Nobody seems to have any alternatives.
I mean, I worry that, and I understand that local communities' feelings can be raised very quickly with this sort of situation, but I worry that extreme elements or folks that have an issue but who have no solution are being listened to, rather than a government taking a pragmatic policy position about what they're going to do with these human beings.
Simon?
I don't know if it's pragmatic politics or cynicism. I do know that the lives of the people who are involved are directly going to be impacted by this, and I think one would need to know a lot more about where they're going instead. And, from my vantage point in the United States, we see a lot of cynical politics at play when it comes to dealing with migrants, including most recently efforts by the authorities in Florida. Ron DeSantis seeking the Republican Party's presidential nomination, of course. Governor Greg Abbott, Republican, who runs things in Texas, literally to bus people out of his state. I mean, they arrive on buses in Washington, D.C., a Democrat-run stronghold, and you see these people just getting off buses and being dumped at the side of the road opposite the vice president's residence at the Naval Observatory, and they sort of wander around looking where they're supposed to go next. I mean, that's cynical politics.
Okay, Joe.
So I was in the debate this afternoon. and welcome the fact that crossings are down and more people are being removed. And so in Stoke-on-Trent, one of the hotels of the 50 that were announced is a hotel bang in the centre of Stoke-on-Trent, opposite the railway station, which I've been speaking about, and my two colleagues, that was totally unsuitable. So from an asylum seeker point of view, it was unsuitable, and from support for the local community, for people who were put there, it was totally unsuitable. So it's a good move. We need to have more of it, but ultimately it's about reducing the numbers of asylum seekers that we need to house.
Stoke-on-Trent Central, Conservative marginal. I mean, forgive me for being cynical about this, but I mean, if we will get this list of 50.
Bless you. I love that you say it's marginal. It was the most marginal seat in the West Midlands before the boundary changes. Now I think it's probably even more marginal than that.
Okay, Alan.
I think there's been a lot of grubby politics over this general issue. And all parties, I think, need to raise their game on this. The reason why there are symptoms that are being tackled with this announcement, and I'm very cynical about the number. It's a very round number. 50 is a very round number. There's no details. There's, like many things, it's here's the announcement for today's press cycle, and then let's get the details out later. The UK has a problem with processing asylum seekers because there aren't safe and legal routes, because there hasn't been sufficient diplomatic effort into getting them, and there has been massive underinvestment over a long, long time in processing capacity to actually get people through the system. And
well, they have got an extra 2,500 people processing them now.
Now, but that's very, very late in the game. So this will hopefully resolve itself. But should asylum seekers be in hotels? No, they shouldn't be. That's a stopgap, obviously. My concern is it becomes a part of the furniture to exploit rather than something that's actually going to be fixed. So I think there's been some really dirty politics on this. And Scotland and the UK does not have a problem with asylum seekers in anything like the sense that other countries have this. So the idea that dear old Blighty's under attack is really the wrong way to look at this. And we need more people, not fewer, in these islands. However you look at the constitutional future, what we need is more immigration, not less.
Can I congratulate you for saying fewer, not less? It's one of my big bugbears. So I didn't have to.
One of mine too. There we go. You're a good company.
0345 6060 973 is the number to call if you'd like to put a question to our panel. We have another half an hour to go. It's 8:33 on LBC News Headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
Downing Street says the number of British nationals killed by Hamas has risen to 12, with a further 5 still missing. The group's leaders say they will release more hostages if Israel halts airstrikes on Gaza. Financial regulators say scrapping a cap on bankers' bonuses will help make the UK more attractive post-Brexit. It's been confirmed the idea, which was initially announced by Kwasi Kwarteng last year, will go ahead. And the immigration ministers confirmed government plans to stop using hotels to house migrants. Robert Jenrick says ministers will start terminating a total of 50 contracts in the coming days. LBC weather. Some showers for eastern Scotland and northeastern England. Heavier rain moving south with an overnight low of 3.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:36, Joe Gideon, Simon Marks, Alan Smith and Mathew Hulbert with us. Now, Alan, your name is spelled A-L-Y-N, which to me sounds a bit Welsh.
It is Welsh, it's very Welsh.
Mm-hmm. So are you Welsh? You're just
My mother's never explained it.
Anyway, moving along. All right, text question from John in Somerset. How does one of the richest countries in the world have nearly 4 million people, including 1 million children, living in destitution, with another approximately 227,000 people currently homeless? Now, this is according to research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. They looked into the extent of destitution in the UK, which means not being able to afford basic essentials such as food, clothing and heating. Alan?
Well, it's funny you say that. I write a column for the national newspaper and I've written it on this report for tomorrow. And it was a deeply depressing read. The fact that whatever you think about Scotland's, the UK's constitutional future, whatever you think about Brexit, for or against, the idea that the UK, Scotland, with the resources that we have, has got so many people in such ingrained poverty is a badge of shame.
How do they calculate this? Because I have to say, I'm always rather suspicious when in a press release they pick out 1 million. It's a very convenient figure, 1 million.
Well, there was lots of figures in the report, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation isn't trying to make political points in a party political sense.
Perish the thought.
Oh, but it's more credible than most operators in this sphere, and There's a challenge for all political parties. There's a challenge for all of us as to, well, is the economic system that we're working to here actually working? Which is why I'm in favour of independence. I think we can do something different with an independent Scotland that we will not be able to do as part of the UK. We've got energy companies that are operating in a broken system. We've got privatised water companies in England that are stripping money out of the public realm, where in Scotland we've kept water in public hands. The benefit system in Scotland has been able to ameliorate, and a terrible phrase that I'm speaking against myself, I've got in tomorrow's column, is that Scotland had a slightly lower increase in destitution than the rest of the UK, so we've been able to mitigate to a greater extent than we otherwise would. But the trouble that we've got with so much of the economic system now is that people are in precarious employment, the gig economy. The benefit system is actually supporting poverty rather than getting people out of it. And the taxation system isn't helping. We've got far too many taxes that are not being raised in a progressive way. And we need to change the game. We need to absolutely change this. COVID has accelerated all of this stuff. And all of us need to get together and work out how to do this better.
Given that you've studied this report, have they given comparative figures for sort of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago? I mean, what's the trend here?
They have gone way back, and the definition of destitution is, forgive me, I'm trying to remember, it's been a long day, but it's have you been able to heat yourself, clean yourself, feed yourself in the last while, and there's been a huge increase in that. And I have to think we start with the benefit system in terms of supporting people who are in trouble. What I'm seeing, and I'm sure Joe is as well, that what we're seeing with the economic crisis presently, with the cost of living crisis, is that it's people who aren't necessarily used to struggling, who are now, because of mortgage rates, energy costs, they'll be able to cope with the mortgage going up, but the energy bills are going up as well. Now we're getting into winter. You know, I've switched on my heating in Stirling just in the past couple of weeks, and already noticing the difference on the smart meter, that it's going to be a hell of a long winter for a lot of people. And politicians need to raise our game in terms of supporting things that actually need supported, and supporting the productive economy rather than elements of the economy that are getting far too many advantages and not contributing their way.
Mathew?
So it's clearly a shocking report, isn't it? And I think the austerity years, for which my party has to take some of the blame after the coalition, have clearly had an impact. I mean, these kind of figures are one of the reasons why I personally...
It was 8 years ago, though. It was 8 years.
Indeed.
Long time.
Indeed. I lost both my borough and parish council seats then, so it's a real trauma for me thinking back to 2015. Thanks, Nick Clegg. But it's why I support, personally, a universal basic income. I think there should be a level beyond which no human being should be able to fall just because of a government decision of whatever party, including the SNP in Scotland and including Labour and including Plaid and all the rest. I think human beings should be able to expect to be able to live with a certain level of dignity and not fall.
But that's what the welfare state is all about. It's supposed to provide the safety net.
But it's clearly not working, is it?
Good. Yep.
It's clearly not working. And I think not only have the austerity years had an impact, but the communities that used to be able to rally round people that were struggling have also been impacted. Libraries gone, Sure Start centres gone, youth centres gone. These are now just places where there's houses and a few shops, not communities.
That's an interesting point, Joe. I mean, who's to blame for? I mean, I don't know if you agree with Matthew on that, but I think he is right that a lot of the fabric of our society, which we all maybe took for granted 20 or 30 years ago, has disappeared. Why is that?
Well, speaking for my own constituency, there is a very strong fabric of support, but there is also a strong level of challenge because of significant people who are living. The technical definition of destitution, I'm not sure would apply, but probably. I think we have to look at the last few years, and clearly COVID and the war in Ukraine had a massive impact on people who were just getting by's ability to just get by, and with significant inflation. So, I mean, the government's answer is obviously bring down inflation, get more people into work, and all of these things are right. But I would say that there is also extra help needed, and I mean, I've got a figure. That they supported each household with £3,300 over the last couple of years. But that's not necessarily a longer-term solution for the people who are at the poorest end of the scale. I mean, the difference between the very rich and the very poor is bigger now than it's ever been, and I think we do need to address that.
Simon?
Well, as you know, I have not lived here for a very long time, but I come here often. And the thing that strikes me every time I come now is that the distinction between getting by and not getting by, that ability to fall to a place from which you cannot recover and recuperate, is getting narrower and narrower. And that's a substantial difference between what I think the ravages of economic downturn have caused here versus what we see in the United States, which is not to minimize the situation in the United States. But I'm also reminded that, in a sense, it's tragic historically. I mean, I remember as a kid growing up, and listeners of a certain vintage may recall this, there was a devastating series of documentaries on, I think, ITV back in the late 70s called Breadline Britain. And, we watched it at home in our, comfortable northwest London home, and you were introduced to this absolutely devastating cycle of poverty that existed. And, then along came the 1980s and the 1990s, and the sense that perhaps the country was pulling itself out of that. And to find yourself now back in a situation where that difference between being able to shop in a supermarket or having to rely on a food bank is wafer thin is kind of devastating historically.
But people will say, well, food banks didn't exist in the 70s, 80s, 90s. They only really started in the 2000s. So that's an indication that things have got worse. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. And people say it's an indictment on our society that food banks exist. Well, it's not just in our society they exist. They exist in very rich countries also.
In the United States.
Switzerland, France,
Absolutely.
United States,
Absolutely. More
Germany.
people using them in America now than ever.
I mean, charity, and again, I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but charity is a good thing. I think it's a marvellous thing that the Trust will Trust and others have done.
But charity is a great thing, and I work for a charity myself and really support the VCS sector, but it's not there to replace large segments of the state. And the trouble is with, it's a perfectly valid political position to believe in a smaller state. But then if you expect...
Liberals used to.
And, well, indeed. So, but I remember the David Cameron years of the big society, and I used to always describe that as a fig leaf for getting charity to do stuff that the government should be doing, that people pay their taxes for. And we shouldn't just say that. Isn't it wonderful now that people can go to these food banks and I mean, Joe seems a really nice person, but you see Tory MPs at their local food banks. Yeah, the local food banks. No, this is horrendous that we have to have food banks in this country.
Joe?
Yes, no, I just wanted to disagree.
You seem
work,
a very nice person.
Well, thank you. I agree with that bit. So I work with Fair Share, and I think food waste is something that we all need to tackle. And food banks play a really important part in the redistribution of food. Food banks also play a really important part in helping the most vulnerable with advice and signposting and all those sorts of things. So it's not just about providing something that the state hasn't provided. It is actually I think a genuine community engagement place, which I wouldn't like to see go.
Well, it'd be nice to think that nobody ever needed to use a food bank, I suppose. So in that sense, it would be good to see.
Well, no, because we'd always have wet food waste. So the recycling and repurposing of surplus food to people who can't afford it. I also do a lot on affordable, healthy food. And I think that when people are squeezed, when their budgets are squeezed, the first thing they tend to not buy are fruit and veg. And so we have health inequalities in areas like mine, which are really bad.
OK, let's move on to some other subjects, including our fun text question at the end of the programme, which everyone always looks forward to. It's 8:47.
This is LBC.
Hiya.
Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
Stephen says, Mr. Dale, whenever anybody says that, I know that there's some trouble coming. Says, please stop calling the UK a wealthy country. We're 26th in terms of GDP per head. This places us well outside the top 10% of the world's wealthiest countries. This explains many of our problems. Thank you. Well, it's lies, damn lies statistics, isn't it? I mean, the reason we describe ourselves as one of the wealthiest countries is in terms of GDP, total GDP, we are either 5th or 6th in the league table, depending on how you measure it. So you're right, Stephen, but you're also wrong. Right, let's go.
That's the most politicians answer of the night.
Seeing as Simon Marks is here, I think we should have a couple of American-related questions. This is a text question from Sam in Cambridge. How likely is it that Donald Trump will become the next US president? P.S. Simon Marks rocks my boat.
Is that a good thing?
Well, Sam's a female.
Thank you very much, Sam. How likely is it? Well, I've got a pound coin in my hand and we could literally flip it. I mean, how likely is it that Donald Trump will be elected president? It's distinctly possible. And I mean, I remember coming on Cross Question shortly after the last presidential election, and a commentator of American affairs, who shall not be named, insisted that he was absolutely going to disappear shortly thereafter. He'd lost the election. He was going to fuss a little bit about the election result being unfair, and then the Republicans would turn against him and he would disappear within weeks.
Who was this?
Well, we'll discuss that in the break.
Here we are. Never to invite them on again for being so wrong.
Here we are towards the end of 2023. He is 50 points clear of his nearest rival in the race for the Republican Party's presidential nomination. The hits keep coming. Only today, more legal setbacks for him. His former lawyer, Michael Cohen, offering devastating testimony about what he claims were Donald Trump's instructions to inflate the value of his assets, part of that civil lawsuit that's underway in New York. We've seen now 3 of Donald Trump's former lawyers pleading guilty to election interference in Georgia, with at least one of them, Sidney Powell, agreeing in a plea bargain to testify against him and to testify against the other co-conspirators who were charged alongside him. And yet every step of the way, his lead over his rivals in the race for the Republican Party's nomination grows, and he cements himself in place as the Republican nominee. And if he is the Republican nominee, and if Joe Biden continues to run for re-election, which now currently seems very likely, even though there is some pressure on him to rethink his decision, this is going to be, once again, a very, very close American election, and it would be foolish, after everything we've seen since 2016, it would be madness to count him out.
Well, that's cheered us all up. Alan?
I hope he doesn't, and I'd usually be a lot more careful with my words on other people's elections, but what he did to US politics, what he did to standards in public life, what he did to misogyny, racism, homophobia, was just awful stuff, beyond politics, beyond decency. There was a degradation of everything. Now, I've got close family in the States, and some of them are Trump voters, in fact, in the discussions we have, because, of course, I'm the example of the liberal European elite that's precisely the problems for all the world.
Well, the personification of such...
Well, it's often been said, to be fair, but that's the way that they see the world, and it's become tribal, it's become dogmatic, it's become, you see whatever facts that suit your argument, you don't actually look at the wider picture. And he had such a pernicious effect on so many things. I would be deeply, deeply troubled to see him back. We've got a bit of this in the UK checks and balances system that everybody thought were a lot stronger than they are. What he was able to do as president in terms of Supreme Court appointments is the most pernicious thing that he did in terms of the structures that the US has that should have all sorts of checks and balances. But they didn't count for that much when there was a concerted effort to undermine them all. And many Americans are now so angry, so discontented. And it's back to the point about precarious employment and the wider world, that a lot of people feel that the system isn't working for them. So suddenly we found the ridiculous, absurd situation that the billionaire white guy was the anti-establishment candidate. Now, that's deeply, deeply worrying. And I'd hate to see him back. I would. I would vote for Joe Biden in a heartbeat against him. But equally, if that's the best the Democrats can come up with, well, this is a wider systemic problem that the US has, and that's of concern to all.
It always makes me nervous when people use the word heartbeat in the same sentence.
Well, but for precisely that reason. Yeah.
Joe?
I mean, I think it goes to the fragility of democracy, quite frankly. I find it frightening, the prospect that the more he's indicted for various sort of criminal activities and everything, the higher his polling ratings go up. In a sense, I mean, we saw this pattern whilst he was president with his Twitter feed and how he could, use it to basically challenge anybody that challenged his right to, be the absolute leader of the free world. Yes, I mean, I think I share your concern.
OK. Mathew, if you can be brief, because I want to fit in one more question.
Absolutely. I'm a big Joe Biden fan. I would also vote for him in a heartbeat. People talk about Joe Biden's age, but the other day Donald Trump gave a speech where he referenced the president that he's facing and called him Barack Obama. So, I mean, I don't think that is really fair. Biden had really good midterm, significant infrastructure funding. I hope Americans vote for Joe Biden.
Right, let's take a question from Ethan in Haywards Heath, who wants to know, is scrapping the cap on bankers' bonuses anything other than obscene? Now, bonuses have been capped at twice bankers' annual salaries since 2014. The scrapping of this cap was announced by Kwasi Kwarteng in the infamous mini-budget 13 months ago, and the Financial Conduct Authority confirmed today that this will go ahead next week. Right, you've each got about 45 seconds to answer this rather complicated question. Mathew, let's start with you.
Well, I think it's absolutely obscene. And, this is just a few questions after we talked about people who are destitute and who are having to choose between heating and eating. And one of the priorities of this Tory government is to make the very, very, very rich even richer. The Tories should be ashamed.
But they'll still be paying tax on this. Why should the government involve itself in private sector salary making?
Well, the government...
As a good Liberal, surely you think the state should stay out of these things?
I think the state has a role in ensuring that people should have enough to be able to live on and heat their homes, which is why I support a universal basic income. And I think that's not helped by making the very, very, very rich even richer.
Simon?
Well, it seems pretty extraordinary that it's a priority, especially given the question that we've all just addressed about that survey on destitution. I mean, from an American perspective, I think successive American governments would argue under similar circumstances, these are private businesses. They get to make as much money as they want to make. American governments don't get involved in restricting those kind of bonuses. But from a moral and ethical standpoint, it certainly looks somewhat questionable.
Joe?
Yeah, so this decision was made by the independent regulator, not the government. And I think it's really important to understand that. It
was announced by Kwasi Kwarteng.
Yeah, but he announced it. But the PRA that came up with the proposal is completely independent from government. He just announced what the independent regulator had put forward.
Nothing to see here. Nothing to do with.
But I mean, if I can explain that the cap, there was an unintended consequence of having the cap, which is that bankers' salaries were increased in order to, because they couldn't have significant bonuses, the salaries went up, and so it wasn't actually fulfilling any sort of wage restraint and everything by having a cap. It just meant that bankers had more basic salary.
The optics of this are terrible, aren't they?
The optics aren't great. I agree entirely, but sadly, it was something that. It's not directly government's responsibility, but the timing, as you say, doesn't look great to the outside world.
Alan Smith.
I find it quite disgusting, and I find it quite counterintuitive. I find it's about moral hazard as much as anything else. I mean, the first duty of a patriot is to pay their taxes. And what we've seen with, at a time just as we're seeing about so many people struggling, so many people who are not used to poverty, going into poverty, the fact that the UK government is allowing these obscene amounts of money to be paid is just entirely wrong. And it's not just about the optics, it's about the values and morality. And I think this government has just lost its way entirely. And I don't mind people making money. I don't mind people getting good salaries if they're actually producing stuff for the wider economy, for the commonweal, paying their taxes. But lots of these people aren't. And this is back to things like the non-dom status and the way that tax havens are used for property deals and other things. And so many of the tax incentives that the UK has been working to for a period of decades have actually prioritised tax evasion and the wealthy to move assets around and not actually looked after the productive economy. And we're talking about food banks earlier, but we weren't talking about precarious employment, the gig economy. So many people are struggling because of lax employment rights in this country, while bankers are getting bonuses. It's obscene.
Right, final question from Gordon in Hampstead. A much-loved memorial clock was recently demolished in Stirling to general dismay. Can the panel name a demolished building or structure that they would like to see rebuilt? Now, just a bit of background to this. I'm sure Alan knows the background programme, the 117-year-old Christie Memorial Clock was taken down in early September after it was found to be structurally unstable. You start on this.
Well, I live 5 minutes from it, and my mailbag was bursting. I have to say, it was a dreadful thing. It was a botched restoration job. It wasn't taken down. There was an attempt to put it back, and it was getting dangerous. It needed restoration, but the restoration massively failed. And the Labour Council, I have to say, have some questions to answer, and there's an inquiry ongoing about this.
Is it ever going to be put back?
Well, the building I want to see restored is the Christie Clock. I want to see it back. Stirling is quite unanimous on this. This is a much loved... Now, of course...
Such a populist.
Well, 117 years isn't that old in Stirling terms. It's quite a modern building for us. But it was part of the city's furniture.
Yeah. No, I get
it shouldn't have been knocked down in the way that it was. And it was a botched restoration job that went wrong. There needs to be consequences for that, and I want to see it rebuilt.
Joe?
I think I'd name the Crooked House in the Black Country. The Crooked House, it was called. So it was a pub that was crooked, but historic, and everybody loved it. And the new owners bulldozed it down.
I remember reading about it.
Yeah. So it needs to...
Have they faced any consequence for that?
Certainly they are looking to face consequences, I think.
Apparently, Corey tells me to shut up because there's legal issues.
Well, hopefully.
Simon?
The answer to the question is the American City Diner on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C., 3 blocks north of my house. A lovely, one of those chrome American-style diners. Nothing is ever built in the United States to last. Our neighbourhood is being demolished around us. We've just seen a major shopping centre pulled down. It's going to be redeveloped. The American City Diner has gone to be turned into some other kind of restaurant coming. And it's not that the food was any good. It's that outside the diner, there was one of those illuminated signs, and it opined politically on the events of the day on a daily basis. And I really miss the sign and its pithy comments on the news of the day.
I'm going to choose the Central Cafe in Union Station.
That's good. That's another good choice. Yeah, absolutely.
One of my favourite places in the world. Matthew?
So I lived in Barwell in Leicestershire until about 18 months ago and represented it for 4 years on the Borough Council. And I had wonderful times as a child at the Liberal Club that used to be there and sadly isn't there anymore. Joe would be very pleased to hear that the Conservative Club is still there. The Liberal Club isn't. I'd rebuild the Liberal Club.
I feel a coalition developing here. Thank you very much indeed to all of you for appearing on the programme tonight. Tomorrow's panel includes the Guardian columnist Rachel Shabby, the Conservative peer Lord Stewart Jackson, the Spectator's Cindy Yu, and a representative from the Labour Party. We hope and believe, because we believe on this programme. Coming up in the next hour, Gideon Keegan, the Education Secretary, says parents have a right to know what sex education their child is being taught. You might think that's a statement of the obvious, but many parents don't feel they have enough detail of what their kids are being taught in school. Want to get your experiences of sex education for your children. Do you think it's up to the mark, or do you think that it needs to be dramatically reformed? I've always thought there should be specialist sex education teachers going from school to school. How about that for an idea?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the head of the United Nations is warning the situation in Gaza is growing more dire by the hour as fighting intensifies between Hamas and Israeli troops. It's been confirmed at least 12 British people were among those killed by Hamas